Hi, everybody. Thank you all for coming, and thank you for those of you who bought books and those of you who will buy books. Thank you for supporting all of you and your attendance. All of this helps us keep doing events like this, and we love to, so we appreciate it. This evening, we have the honor of hearing from Brian Biswas about his novel, The Astronomer. Brian Biswas has published over 60 short stories, both in the United States and internationally. The Astronomer is his first novel, and he will publish another short story collection, Blister and Other Stories, in November of this year. We hope you enjoy the event. Thank you again, and remember, please, you are welcome to grab a copy of The Astronomer up front, if you haven't already. Right. I'll turn it over.
Get set up. Hey everybody.
Hi.
Hello. So great to see everybody here. Can I be heard? This is a new microphone. It's actually a really nice microphone. Is that good?
That's better.
Can I be heard over here?
No. No, its tone is about like this.
How about over here?
No.
No. So I've got to be here.
You gotta be
Right there? Okay. All right. So this is terrific. So many people that I know, people that I don't know, and people that I have not seen for years. It's wonderful. So Flyleaf posted this afternoon that I am tonight's entertainment. It makes me feel like I'm a stand-up comic. So anyway, thanks for taking the time out of your busy day to come and listen to me read. It really makes a lot of difference. It makes a lot of difference when you're talking and you're not talking to a bunch of empty seats, which has happened before. So this book, The Astronomer, is my first book, first novel. It was supposed to come out two and a half years ago, but then the pandemic appeared and everything got put on hold. People have told me that, well, the pandemic must have been great for writers because people are at home all the time and they get to read all the time. Number one, there are lots of other things you can do at home, like binge on Netflix or whatever. But unless your name is Stephen King, the publishers didn't want to put out your book during the pandemic because they can't get it into bookstores. They can't get you into bookstores. So they put a lot on hold. They said, just hold tight. In my case, my publisher also had a lot of problems with the distributor. Their distributor had a lot of people out sick with COVID. The paper mill they used in Canada was shut down at one point because of COVID. I mean, things that you don't think about, so they couldn't distribute. So my publisher said, by the time that cleared, then after like a year, then there's a backlog of books that didn't get published that year. So I remember my publisher said, wait a year, and then that became wait 2 years, and then you'll be the first book out in the 3rd year. So this is like 2.5 years late, but it's out. In fact, this was published about 2 weeks ago. And Flyleaf survived. Because a lot of independent bookstores did not survive. I mean, I read, I'm not sure, maybe you two know, I read that about a quarter of the independent bookstores went out of business during the pandemic. Now some of them have come back, but a lot haven't. And regardless, even if you didn't go out of business, you had to close. I'm sure you all remember having to pick up your books outside here. So that was tough, but Flyleaf survived, I think, thanks to this community that supported them. I think you're stronger than ever. Keep it going. If you can, buy a book tonight, buy a couple of books tonight. They'd really appreciate it. In fact, I'd like nothing better to see all the books gone. Purchased legally, of course. Okay, enough of the preamble, on to the Astronomer. I'm going to do something a little bit different because I'm supposed to entertain you tonight. So I'm going to put on my interviewer's hat. Okay, does that look good? Okay. So I can't talk over here, right? Okay, so I'm the interviewer. So, Mr. Author, what is your book about? Well, it's about a man who has a mental disease and how he tries to overcome it. I've read about that 1,000 times before. What makes your book different? Well, he's a young man, a down on his luck astronomer. And one day he's diagnosed with epilepsy. When treatments fail, he's told he's going to have to control it using his own mind. He does this. And then he realizes he's also gained the ability to travel throughout the cosmos at will, making scientific discoveries to his heart's content and reviving his reputation. Huh? When his wife realizes he's nuts and leaves him, he must make a decision. Should he try to win her back or abandon himself to the cosmos? I see. Anything else? Every word in this book is true. And much of this book is true. Okay, enough of those two. So that in a nutshell is the book. It's a schizophrenic book about a schizophrenic man. It's both a love story and a man's attempt to find his place in the universe. So I'm going to read the first few pages. But first, let's see. First, a show of hands. How many people have read the book or parts of it? Probably not. Yeah, you've read the whole book. Okay, so for those of you who have read it, I'll tell you what you just read. And for those of you who haven't, you'll learn what awaits. But before I read, let me say a few words about the novel's structure. It's a bit odd, but it's not that odd. By that I mean it jumps around, not in time, but in space, and all within the mind of the main character, of Franz Herbert. It's a slightly disorienting read, but I wrote it that way on purpose to mirror Franz's disoriented mind. Not only is it disorienting, but it gets more and more so as the novel progresses, as his mind becomes more fragmented. So the structure, the Astronomer, the book proper, is Franz Herbert's autobiography. It's written in somewhat flowery prose. The chapters talk about the important events in Franz's life, along with diary entries he kept along the way. And that's probably 95% or so of the work. And then there's a postscript written by Herbert's psychiatrist. It's a completely different style. It's a straightforward, just the facts ma'am account, setting forth the events as the psychiatrist saw them. This is the psychiatrist that Franz went to late in life. And it's not the same as Franz's account. And then there's a prologue written by a man named Martin Pasquale, a man who met Herbert at an Astronomical Society meeting late in life. The prologue talks about how Pasquale came upon the manuscript, for it had never been published. Herbert never really meant to publish it. It was just the story of his life. And so it tells how Pasquale put it back together and published it. As Pasquale writes in the prologue, Franz was like a mare, Franz Herbert was like a mare that had been shattered. The various chapters and diary entries he had written strewn about. Pasquale tried to put the pieces back together. But, as he writes, there are many ways to reconstruct a broken mare. Which is true? Does the question itself even have meaning? We're left with a book that almost makes sense, but not quite. And if you know magical realism, that's basically what it is. Okay, so does that make sense, or is that a muddle? Okay? Okay, so I'm going to read the first few pages of Franz's autobiography. So I'm going to have to turn myself into Franz Herbert. And this is written in the first person. This is chapter 1, and it's called The Moons of Jupiter. When the doctor told me I had epilepsy, I was shocked. I suspected something might be wrong. I heard voices. I was other places. But never this most hideous of diseases. This could never happen to me. There was no history of epilepsy in my family. I'd never suffered from seizures or auras of any type. I was 20 years old. I had my entire life ahead of me. Perhaps the doctor was mistaken, but alas, subsequent tests confirmed the original diagnosis. Petit mal seizures that would only worsen over time unless immediate action was taken. The doctor gave me pills that turned the walls of my bedroom many colors. They pulsated. They bled. One sultry August night, the year was 1926, the year Arthur Eddington published The Internal Constitution of the Stars, I clung to my girlfriend, Isabella, as I felt my mind beginning to swoon and then convulse. We were in the backyard of my parents' home in Peoria, Illinois, gazing up at the constellations. And suddenly the firmament came crashing down upon me, and I was drowning in light. Oh my God, I thought, you're going to die. That, by the way, is all true, and it happened to me. An epileptic's life is no fun. Let me tell you, for one thing, you never know where you are. You could be here, you could be there. And in reality, you're neither place, or rather, you're in both places simultaneously. Twilight worlds that flash in and out of existence. I was passed from physician to physician. Nobody knew what to do with me. The diagnoses multiplied, the prescriptions multiplied, but my condition only worsened. Eventually, I ended up in a local hospital. I was filled with so many drugs, I didn't know who I was or who I'd ever been. A specialist from University Medical Center examined me, and to my amazement, he took me off all medication. "There's nothing wrong with you," he said. "It's all in your mind." I said, somewhat sarcastically, "Of course it's in my mind." But he was right. It was all in my mind. And when I realized that, I began to recover. I learned to control my epilepsy, and then I learned to control other things. That's the Twilight Zone. Galileo Galilei did not discover the moons of Jupiter in January 1610, as history has recorded. The German astronomer Simon Marius did in November 1609. Marius, however, never published his observations, mentioning them only to his friend Johannes Kepler, who wrote of them in his memoirs many years later. Galileo made extensive observations and published them in the journal Sidereus Nuncius in March 1610. In 1614, Marius did provide what would one day become the names of the Jovian moons, based on a suggestion from Kepler. Jupiter, Marius wrote, is much blamed by the poets on account of his irregular loves. 3 maidens are especially mentioned as having been clandestinely courted by Jupiter with success: Io, daughter of the river, Callisto, daughter of Lycaon, and Europa of Agenor. And then there was Ganymede, the handsome son of King Troy, whom Jupiter, having taken the form of an eagle, transported to heaven on his back. I think, therefore, that I shall not be amiss if I call the first moon Io, the second Europa, the third, on account of its majesty of light, Ganymede, and the fourth, Callisto. The first moon I came upon was Callisto, the outermost of the Galilean satellites and the only one to orbit beyond Jupiter's radiation belts. Callisto is the 3rd largest moon in the solar system and is about the size of the planet Mercury. It's the darkest of Jupiter's moons and is the most heavily cratered object in the solar system. Its surface age is estimated to be 4 billion years. I put down near Laufen a shallow, circular crater about 62 miles across. Callisto doesn't have an atmosphere, so I put on my spacesuit and emerged from the ship, gently stepping out onto the oldest landscape in the solar system. I traveled along the Olinda Basin, following the curve of the crater. Now, if you've never been to Callisto, you'll want to listen closely. Many of Olinda's features are obscured by ejecta from the crater. The ejecta covers an older, more densely cratered surface that includes sinuous ridges and fractures. There's a saltwater ocean deep inside Callisto that is reached by means of a channel found at the bottom of one of those fractures. It's a 2-day hike through splendid geologic formations, thermal vents, sulfuric lakes, and enormous ice sculptures. It was when I reached the ocean that I began my search for Callisto, the daughter of Lycaon, for she was known to inhabit this region of the moon. I doubt I'll ever find her, though. Probably she died in this godforsaken place out of sheer loneliness, and who could blame her? At one point, I see what looks like a winged deer flying overhead. The bluish-green antlers are magnificent, but it might have been my imagination. Epilepsy is a disorder of the brain, specifically excessive electrical activity of nerve cells. There are two main seizure types. In the most dramatic, known as grand mal seizures, the subject loses consciousness, falls to the ground, shakes violently, and becomes stiff. He may become blue in the lips and foam at the mouth. I've never had one of those seizures, but there's another type, known as petit mal seizures, in which there's a simple alteration of consciousness without the theatrics. With grand mal seizures, there's often a warning of seizure onset. For example, an olfactory, visual, or auditory hallucination, or a sensation of pain or nausea. With petit mal seizures, there's usually no warning, and in my case, there's no warning. Isabella tells me I appear to lose consciousness, but that the loss is brief, that I stare straight ahead, blink, fidget with my hands, and sometimes appear nervous. But that's not the way I perceive it. Rather, I feel like I'm someplace else, time out of mind, and the feeling persists for maybe 2 or 3 minutes. Sometimes I feel I'm both here, in this world, and there, in that world, and that's a very strange feeling, let me tell you. Life with 1 foot in 2 doors. None of the known causes of epilepsy are pretty. Brain damage, brain infection, brain tumor, brain hemorrhage. I don't think there's anything wrong with my brain. My epilepsy is due to something else, some other abnormality, but I have no idea what. My seizures are often followed by drowsiness, which lasts several hours. During our courtship, I was forthright with Isabella. I told her my brain was filled with epileptic vibrations, which could only be controlled and would never go away. I told her she could leave. I'd understand. In fact, I expected her to leave. She said it didn't matter. She would never leave. I loved Isabella for this, for her acceptance of my condition. Of course you know what this means, I said. It means I am not now and never will be normal. It means your life with me will be confusing at best. It means there will be good times, but there will be bad. It means there will be times you won't know who I am. There will be times I won't know who I am. And still you can say that you love me? Don't be silly, she laughed. I love you for who you are. The second moon I came upon was Ganymede, a pretty moon, the color of milk chocolate. At 3,273 miles in diameter, it's the largest moon in the solar system, larger even than Mercury and Pluto, and 3/4 the size of Mars. It would be a planet if it was in the right place, only it isn't, and that's something to think about. Like Callisto, Ganymede is composed of a rocky core that takes up nearly half its diameter. It's covered with a thin crust of rock and ice. My destination was crater K2, a dark crater about 19 miles across. It took the better part of a day to reach K2 from my spaceship, and the skies were growing dark when I scrambled over the narrow rim wall and crossed the crater's smooth basin. It was in the middle of the basin, an area covered with volcanic deposits, where I found it, a stone image of Ganymede himself, the beautiful one. The statue was 6 feet high and exquisitely sculpted. And if I had not known better, I would have sworn it was alive. In its outstretched left hand, Ganymede held a chalice. I gazed at the statue and I sighed. It's beautiful. I know that Isabella, like the statue, is immortal. In my mind, she's immortal. I reach for the chalice. I know the liquid it contains will solve my problems. It will make me immortal. And then both Isabella and I will be immortal and we will never part. But of course, the statue vanishes the moment my fingers are about to touch the magic cup, and I'm left alone once again. Suddenly, I feel a seizure descending over me like a fog, and I close my eyes and breathe deeply as the doctors had directed. Luckily, the seizure passes quickly, but I am left alone, and I am afraid. Isabella and I married on the 20th of October, 1927, after a year-long engagement. The engagement was the happiest time of my life, and as I think back on it now, I can only weep at my good fortune. I don't think I had a single seizure the entire time. It was a wedding ceremony I'll never forget. In attendance was Isabella's parents and mine, my 2 brothers, her sister's husband, and their 2 children, and 6 of Isabella's friends. We are gathered here today, the preacher began. That's all I remember. Isabella says I became rigid, my eyes staring into space, arms stiff at my sides. She says it lasted at least 5 minutes, longer than usual. And though she told everyone to remain calm, they reached a point when they could wait no longer and a doctor was called. I don't remember any of this. The next thing I recall, Isabella and I were hand in hand, running down the church steps into a blizzard of rice. Isabella told me later that just when the wedding party was about to panic, I snapped out of my trance and returned to normalcy. I'm not God, she said, or rather whispered, so that only she could hear. She threw her bouquet into the air and her sister caught it, and I caught her eye, Isabella's eye, and I saw what I'd hoped I'd never see, a look of uncertainty. This only for a brief second, mind you, but one I'd never forget. For you see, though Isabella had always insisted she'd never leave me, and though this most likely was true, she harbored lingering doubts. That look betrayed her. So I'll stop there. That's emotional. So I'll stop there with Fran's stewing. So is there any hope for that marriage? What do you think?
Depends on what you mean by hope for that marriage.
Is it gonna last? Okay, does anybody have any questions? Requests?
So how long did you research to come up with all this information that you pack into it?
I get that question a lot. Well, for this, I've been studying astronomy since I was a teenager, so I knew a fair amount. And then the internet is a wonderful resource. But I spent, believe me, I spent 10 years writing this book. And then another 2.5 years to get it published. So this was like 12 years. The first draft went pretty quickly. What I spent most of my time doing was editing, and it's a complicated book, and it jumps around, as you can tell. And I had to, like the first version had, so there's a chapter, and then there's an entry from his diary. He kept a diary of his travels around the cosmos. So I'd have a chapter, and then a diary entry, and then a chapter, and a diary entry. And I tried to make the diary entries reflect that point of his life. The first draft I did, there were, I think, 5, maybe 6 diary entries between each chapter, which is, there are 16 chapters, so that's what, 80 diary entries. So that just completely overwhelmed the whole plot, and you just got completely lost. So after one of my beta readers read that, I decided to cut that down from 5 to 1. So from 80 to 16. A couple of those I was able to weave into some of the later chapters, but most of them just ended up on the cutting room floor. The research was actually a lot of fun. Margaret?
You said that, or your intro person said that you published a lot of short stories, and since this book took so long to become reality, can you write other things during that period of time? Or
Absolutely. Oh, no, absolutely. That's what you have to do.
Okay.
Yeah, so I typically have 2 or 3 projects going on at once. So I'll do a draft of this, and then I'll put it aside. Well, I'll give it to my editor wife, and she'll tell me it's absolute crap, and she won't want to see it anymore, and it'll be all marked up, and I'll cry for a couple days and put it aside for a few months and go on to something else. After a few months, you kind of forget what you wrote to begin with, so you can look at it with completely fresh eyes. And I typically look at it and go, ugh, you know, and then you start over, and you just repeat that. But if you have another project to go on to, you know, you can do that. That's an interesting question too. I actually wrote the postscript, the epilogue where the psychiatrist says what was really going on with Franz. I actually wrote that first as a short story and had that published. And I don't know what triggered my mind, but I thought, wow, that would be, why don't I expand what he did from the point of view of the patient. So I made that the whole novel within that at the end. So that's how it came to be. Brenda?
So how did you get inspired to write about the cosmos and a man with epilepsy? How did you tie those two?
I mean, a lot of this really is true. It was a false diagnosis, but I was diagnosed with epilepsy when I was 14, and they gave me pills that turned the walls of my bedroom many colors. It was awful. It was like these colors dripping down from the walls. I remember going to my mom and saying, "Is this normal?" And she called the doctor up, and they said, "You better take him off of that." I think I was up on that for like a week. And they put me in a hospital, and I was examined by a specialist, and he said, "There's nothing wrong with you." And I said, "Great." I mean, I think I was 14, so I was just happy I didn't have this. But I still had all these bizarre feelings. And I remember asking my mom, "So what's wrong with me?" And she said, "It's called puberty." But that's all true. Anything else?
Just
Yes,
one,
Jorge.
Brian.
Yeah.
As you know, I write science fiction.
Yes, you're a magical
I
realist.
haven't read the book, but it resonates with me. There is a classic book on science fiction called The Star Maker written in the 1920s by Olaf Stapleton. Someone interacts with aliens and starts an out-of-body experience that travels through the entire galaxy. I always thought that was just, I can't imagine how people saw that book in the 1920s.
What's the Star Maker?
Star Maker.
I've read another of his books.
But the point is that he comes back from that journey, and there is no context of what happened to him. I mean, how that experience changes him. Your book provides a human dimension to someone that starts kind of a cosmic trip like that.
Yeah.
And I think that I find that fascinating because
Yeah.
it's completely missing of some area.
So I've been asked, is he really traveling around the solar system or not? And my publisher says if I were to answer that question, she'd have to kill me. So I can't say. But I will say, when I wrote this, I did not imagine that he was really traveling. It's the way he's trying to deal with his what's going on in his life. Kelly.
So you said this is your first novel.
Right.
Have you written others and just haven't published them, or
Yes.
talked about novels versus the short stories?
Yeah, I've actually got a lot of stuff that's ready to go because of the pandemic. I mean, that was 2-3 years. You know, I'm retired, and so what am I going to do? What's a writer going to do but write? So I have a second book of short stories that'll be coming out this fall, and then I have another novel. It's a more traditional novel called Floating on Air that will hopefully be out end of 2024, maybe the beginning of 2025. And then I'm working on a third novel right now.
Are you more interested in novels now than short stories? Or you like
Actually, I am now. I mean, I've been writing since I was a teenager. I published my first short story in my early 20s. I tried to write a novel right off the bat, of course, right? But that's not going to work. So, but I found that writing short stories is really good when you're starting out because you can finish it much quicker. You can get it out and get some feedback. If you do a novel, it's going to take you a year. And then if you send it out, that whole process can take a year. And you're probably not going to get any feedback. So I started writing in the early 90s when you actually got more feedback from magazines back then than you do now. It's kind of sad. You used to get feedback, and then it became you get a rejection letter, but it might be personalized a little bit. And then you just get a vanilla rejection letter. Now they don't even send you anything.
So it sounds like your success, in writing, right, and actually getting it approved and actually published happened pretty early. I was just wondering, and it's a difficult question to ask, is there any time when you feel like, well, no, I'm not a good writer, and
all the time.
And I shouldn't even try to publish this. I should go,
all the time. There were so many times. There was one time I took my short stories and threw them in a dumpster. This was in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, because I just wasn't getting anywhere, and I couldn't. I felt the only way I could break myself from writing was to throw it all out. I wish I kept a couple of the stories. But yeah, it's tough. I've also found though that at times when I was just going to give up, I'd get something to get published. My first book, Betrayal and Other Stories, I was in a real down period then, and I was having wicked insomnia. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't work. And I remember in one of my real down days, I wrote to the editor of a magazine called Perihelion Science Fiction, and I said, I just told him how much I liked the magazine, and I said I particularly liked their book reviewer, Carol Keene, who I thought did really good book reviews. And he said, thanks, I'll pass that information on to her. And he did, because the next day I got a letter from her that said, Brian, I love you. This is true. And I said, well, if you love me, would you like to take a look at this story? So I sent it in to her, and she wrote it, and she said, this is terrific. Will you send me another story? And can you see where that goes? And then she finally said, you need to get a collection together and get it published. And I said, well, that's wonderful. I've been trying to do that for decades. And she said, well, there's some names I can suggest to you. So she gave me a bunch of names, and one place, Rogue Star Press, they accepted it. I found out later that she had written to them saying, you need to take a good look at this. So that's like something out of the blue. Right? After decades of sending out stuff blindly to the slush pile. I don't know if that's luck or persistence. What is it, Paul?
Writing is the rejection business,
It really
not the
is.
exception,
It
not
really
the
is.
acceptance business.
Yeah.
So once you resign yourself to that, you just are depressed for less time.
Yeah, you're going to be depressed. You'll learn early on that you have to develop a thick skin, and if you don't develop a thick skin, you're going to give up writing.
Absolutely. That's why I mean, even the best writers on that.
Oh, absolutely.
And the best published and go, my agent will not put this book forward to people that are fairly successful. What's wrong with them?
Well, let's see. John Kessel. Do people know John Kessel?
Yes.
He's a well-known science fiction writer. He teaches at NC State. I was at a conference in Orlando, Florida, a year or so ago, and he was gonna give a reading, and he said right before his reading, he had on a sad face. He said, well, the story I'm going to read, it was just rejected like 10 minutes before I came. And I forget exactly what the rejection letter said, but it was not kind at all. And he's a well-known writer. So yeah, you're always going to have rejection. Yeah.
Was it difficult for you, having had that earlier diagnosis of epilepsy, was it difficult for you to sort of go back to that in writing this?
Oh, yeah. It triggered some things.
Yeah.
And that was actually worse than I expected. And that got worse the more I got into this book. I really got into this character as I wrote. And so that was kind of hard. It did eventually go away, so maybe it was puberty. How are we for time?
You can take a couple more.
Okay, any other questions? Can I read another page? Okay. I'm going to read the last page of the book, but there are no spoilers. There are no spoilers. This is the last diary entry. It wasn't dated, and it doesn't refer to other events in the book. So Martin Pasquale didn't know where to put it, so he just stuck it on at the end. But I think it kind of sums up the themes of Franz's life, and it's called The Room at the End of the World. This is for Roger.
Yeah.
The Room at the End of the World. So again, this is Franz Herbert talking at the very end of his life. The room at the end of the world. There's a door at the end of the hall. You open it and see a second door. You open that and see a third. When you open this door, you're not surprised to see a fourth. You continue stepping inside and opening door. You do this for a long, long time. At some point in this repetitive process, you realize that each door has been painted a different color. You have no idea why this is so, but you find it interesting. A while later, you realize that not only is each door a different color, but that the colors are following in order the colors of the spectrum. Shades of red, orange, yellow, green, blue, and violet. And that each color is more brilliant, more radiant than the one before. It's an interesting phenomenon. It never occurs to you that you might be lost and had better go back. And it's a good thing this doesn't occur to you. For if you were to turn around, you would see there are no doors behind you. They're dissolving into nothingness the moment you step through them. At last, you reach what you believe must be the final door. It's painted a brilliant white. It's so bright, you must cover your eyes to keep from being blinded as you open the door. You expect to see a stately room, for it's been your experience that all doors lead to rooms. And if one must pass through many doors to reach a room, it must be because it's a very stately room indeed. Or if not a room, perhaps another door, this being a labyrinth into which you've stumbled and from which you will never escape. But you see neither a room nor a door. You see nothing, emptiness, the void. You're at a loss. Taking a deep breath, which you realize may well be your last, you step through the door. Nothing happens. Did you really expect something to happen? Only another door appears, and you step through this one, too. That's it. Thank you all for coming. Hope you enjoy.
I'm wondering if ITS folks, past, present, might be willing to pose with Brian? Or, or UNC folks in general?
I know this is like a UNC meeting.
It is, it looks like it. I'll check with you later.